They said the moon curse could never be broken, only fed. The auction square of Blackmore Hollow had never been silent until the royal carriage arrived. Merchants stopped shouting, children hid behind their parents, and even the restless horses lowered their heads as four riders wearing silver wolf crests guided a black carriage through the crowd. Everyone knew what that crest meant. Someone was about to disappear into the Alpha King's fortress, and no one ever returned the same. Evelyn Carter stood on the worn wooden platform with her wrists bound by nothing more than faded rope, though she knew she could have walked away if anyone had truly wanted her to stay. No one did. At 22, she had become the forgotten Omega of Greyridge Pack, the girl whispered about whenever crops failed or storms arrived too early. Some claimed her weak wolf had angered the moon goddess. Others insisted her rejection ceremony 3 years earlier had marked her as cursed forever. Whatever the reason, people had long ago decided that misfortune followed wherever Evelyn walked. So when the Royal Council demanded a living sacrifice for the Alpha King's worsening moon curse, the elders did not hesitate. They offered the rejected Omega without argument, calling it a noble contribution to the kingdom while refusing to meet her eyes. Evelyn searched the faces gathered below the platform, hoping to find one person willing to object, one voice brave enough to say her life mattered. Instead, she found lowered gazes, uneasy silence, and quiet relief that someone else had been chosen instead of their own daughter or sister. A cold autumn breeze carried the scent of pine through the square as the captain of the Royal Guard unfolded a parchment sealed with black wax. His voice echoed across the crowd. By decree of the Crown, Evelyn Carter shall be escorted to Blackstone, keep to serve the Alpha King until the moon curse is lifted or her service comes to its natural end. No one applauded. No one protested. They simply accepted the judgment as though it had always been inevitable. Evelyn swallowed the ache rising in her throat. She had spent years believing that if she worked harder, smiled longer, and endured every cruel whisper with quiet dignity, someone would eventually see her worth. Standing on that platform, she finally understood the painful truth. Some people only noticed kindness after it was gone. The captain stepped forward and gently cut the rope around her wrists. The unexpected gesture startled her. "You won't need these," he said quietly, avoiding the eyes of the crowd. "No prisoner has ever walked into Blackstone Keep. Only volunteers." Evelyn almost laughed at the impossible choice hidden inside those words. Volunteer? She had never been given one. Still, she rubbed the faint marks left by the rope and climbed into the waiting carriage without resistance. The heavy door closed behind her with a muted thud, shutting out the voices of the only home she had ever known. As the wheels rolled across the cobblestone road and Greyridge disappeared behind distant hills, Evelyn watched the fading rooftops through the small carriage window. No one chased after her. No one called her name. Miles ahead, hidden beyond forests covered in silver mist, stood Blackstone Keep, where a king cursed by the moon was waiting for another sacrifice. What neither the kingdom nor Evelyn could possibly know was that the curse had been waiting for her long before she was ever born. The journey lasted until the last light of day disappeared behind endless rows of towering pine trees. Evelyn had stopped counting the miles hours ago, but she knew they had traveled farther than she had ever imagined. The farther the carriage rolled into the northern wilderness, the quieter the world became. Small villages vanished. Farmhouses disappeared. Even birds seemed unwilling to cross into the land surrounding Blackstone Keep. The captain riding beside the carriage finally slowed the horses as enormous iron gates emerged from the drifting evening fog. Beyond them stood a fortress carved directly into the mountainside, its gray stone walls rising hundreds of feet into the sky like they had grown from the earth itself. Countless windows reflected the pale moonlight, yet almost none were lit. The castle did not feel abandoned. It felt as though it had been holding its breath for years. The gates opened without a sound. Guards lined the entrance in polished silver armor, but none looked proud. They carried themselves like exhausted people who had forgotten what hope felt like. As Evelyn stepped down from the carriage, the cold mountain air wrapped around her shoulders. It was noticeably colder than the valley she had left behind, and every breath carried the scent of snow even though autumn had only begun. An elderly woman wearing deep blue robes waited near the entrance hall. Her silver hair was gathered into a simple braid, and gentle lines surrounded tired but kind eyes. "Welcome to Blackstone Keep," she said softly. "My name is Margaret. I oversee the household." Evelyn nodded politely. "Thank you." Margaret studied her face for several quiet seconds before speaking again. "You are younger than I expected." Evelyn managed a faint smile. "Most people tell me I look older." Something almost like sadness crossed the older woman's expression. "Perhaps they only noticed your burdens." She motioned for Evelyn to follow through a series of long stone corridors where moonlight spilled across polished floors through towering windows. Portraits of kings and queens watched silently from the walls. Every servant they passed lowered their heads, not out of disrespect toward Evelyn, but because worry had become second nature inside these halls. Finally, Margaret stopped before a pair of carved oak doors. She hesitated before placing one weathered hand against the wood. "There is something you deserve to know before you meet His Majesty." Evelyn straightened instinctively. Margaret lowered her voice. "The stories outside these walls are incomplete. People call him a monster because it is easier than admitting he has suffered for years." Evelyn listened without speaking. "Every healer believed strength could defeat the curse," Margaret continued. "Every scholar searched ancient books. Every priest prayed through endless nights. None of them succeeded because they all fought the curse." She looked directly into Evelyn's eyes. "No one ever tried to understand the man trapped beneath it." A deep sound echoed somewhere far inside the castle. It was not a roar. It sounded more like a lonely breath carried through empty stone halls. Evelyn felt an unexpected ache in her chest. "Is he dangerous?" she whispered. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment before answering honestly. Only to himself. Before Evelyn could ask another question, a young guard hurried toward them, breathing heavily. "The moon is rising early," he said. "The king has awakened." Margaret's calm expression tightened. She turned back to Evelyn, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is one thing you must remember no matter what you see tonight." Evelyn waited. Margaret reached for her trembling hands. "If he tells you to run, believe that he is trying to save you, not himself." The heavy doors slowly opened on their own, revealing a dim chamber bathed entirely in silver moonlight. Standing alone beside an enormous window was a tall man dressed in black, perfectly still, his broad shoulders facing the night sky. Before Evelyn could take her first full breath, he spoke without turning around. His voice was calm, weary, and carried the weight of someone who had stopped expecting miracles long ago. "You should leave while you still can." Evelyn stood frozen beneath the silver glow pouring through the towering windows as the man before her remained perfectly still. His back was broad beneath a dark coat, his hands resting lightly against the ancient stone ledge as though he carried the weight of the entire kingdom on his shoulders. Nothing about him resembled the terrifying monster whispered about across the northern territories. There was only silence, heavy enough to make every heartbeat sound louder. Margaret quietly stepped backward and closed the doors behind her, leaving Evelyn alone inside the vast chamber. The soft click echoed through the room before fading into complete stillness. The man finally lowered his head. "Did they tell you why you are here?" he asked without turning around. Evelyn swallowed before answering honestly. "They said I was chosen to help break the curse." A faint, humorless laugh escaped him. "No, they chose you because they believe you are easier to lose than someone they love." His words struck deeper than she expected because they carried no cruelty, only painful certainty. Slowly he turned to face her. Evelyn caught her breath. Damian Blackwood looked nothing like the legends painted by frightened storytellers. His dark hair brushed the collar of his coat, and his pale skin reflected the moonlight that filled the chamber. His silver eyes looked exhausted rather than dangerous, as though sleep had abandoned him years ago. He studied her quietly before offering a sad smile that barely reached his eyes. "You should leave before the moon rises any higher." Evelyn looked toward the enormous windows. "It has already risen." Damien followed her gaze. The moon now hung above the mountain peaks, brighter than she had ever seen. Its light spilled across the marble floor like liquid silver. The room suddenly grew colder. A sharp wind slipped through the open window, although the night outside had been perfectly still only moments before. Damien closed his eyes. His breathing became slower, heavier. His hands tightened against the stone ledge. "Please," he whispered, "do not come closer." Every warning she had heard during the journey echoed inside her mind. "Run. Hide. Do not look into his eyes." Yet something stronger than fear held her feet in place. She did not see hatred in the man standing before her. She saw loneliness. She remembered the empty faces in her village, the people who had looked through her as though she no longer existed. Somehow the loneliness inside this king looked painfully familiar. Damien suddenly stepped backward, struggling to steady himself as another cold gust swept through the chamber. Moonlight shimmered across the polished floor, and faint silver markings slowly appeared beneath the sleeves of his coat, glowing softly against his skin before fading again. Evelyn watched with quiet amazement rather than fear. The stories had called it a curse, but standing only a few feet away, it felt more like an endless burden someone had carried alone for far too long. Damien kept his eyes closed. "Why are you still here?" he asked through an unsteady breath. "Everyone else runs." Evelyn answered before she could overthink the words. "Because everyone else already left you." Silence settled between them once again. The wind slowly calmed. The unnatural chill that had filled the chamber eased until only the ordinary mountain air remained. Damien opened his eyes in disbelief. For the first time in years, the silver glow beneath his skin had disappeared instead of growing stronger beneath the full moon. Neither of them noticed the palace physician standing unseen beyond the slightly open doorway, watching the impossible scene unfold with widening eyes as he quietly whispered to himself, "The curse has never fallen silent before." Evelyn remained where she stood, unable to explain why the room suddenly felt warmer even though the moon still filled every corner with its pale light. Damien stared at his own hands as though they belonged to someone else. For years he had measured every full moon by pain, restless nights, and frightened faces. Yet now the strange silver markings beneath his skin had vanished as quietly as morning mist. He looked at Evelyn again, searching her face for answers she clearly did not possess. Before either of them could speak, the chamber doors opened. Margaret entered first, followed closely by Dr. Henry Whitmore, the royal physician whose silver spectacles had nearly slipped from his face in his hurry. His eyes moved immediately to the king before looking around the room in disbelief. "Your Majesty," he whispered carefully, "how do you feel?" Damien answered without taking his eyes off Evelyn. "Quiet." The single word filled the room with more hope than anyone had dared to imagine. Dr. Whitmore slowly approached, checking Damien's pulse with practiced hands before stepping back in stunned silence. "Your heartbeat has steadied," he murmured. "It always becomes irregular after moonrise." Margaret covered her mouth as tears gathered in her tired eyes. She had watched countless healers fail inside these walls, each arriving full of confidence before leaving with broken spirits. Never once had she witnessed the curse retreat on its own. Dr. Whitmore turned toward Evelyn with open curiosity. "Did you perform any healing ritual?" Evelyn gently shook her head. "No." "Did you speak an ancient prayer?" "No." "Did you touch His Majesty?" She looked down at her empty hands. "No." The physician frowned. Nothing about the situation made sense. Every record stored in the royal library described the curse growing stronger beneath the full moon, never weaker. Yet tonight the impossible had happened simply because a rejected Omega had remained in the room instead of running away. Damien finally broke the silence. She did something none of the others ever did. Margaret looked toward him. What was that? His expression softened almost imperceptibly. She stayed. The words lingered inside the chamber long after they were spoken. Evelyn felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassed by attention she had never wanted. To her, remaining had not been bravery. It had simply felt wrong to abandon someone who had spent years expecting everyone to leave. Dr. Whitmore quietly removed a small leather notebook from his pocket and began writing careful observations. Every few moments he glanced back toward Evelyn as though afraid she might suddenly disappear along with the miracle he had just witnessed. Outside the chamber windows, clouds drifted across the moon before slowly clearing again. The cold wind that had haunted the castle every full moon failed to return. Even the servants gathering nervously in the corridor noticed something different. The usual sounds of breaking furniture, shouted orders, and sleepless panic never came. Instead, an unfamiliar calm settled over Blackstone Keep. Far below in the castle chapel, candles that had burned every night for nearly a decade continued flickering before an ancient stone statue of the moon goddess. Father Samuel, the elderly priest, looked toward the ceiling as though sensing a change carried through the very walls. He quietly whispered, "The castle is breathing again." Meanwhile, hidden inside a private study overlooking the northern courtyard, another pair of eyes watched the moon through narrow windows. Lord Victor Blackwood, the king's uncle and acting royal advisor, slowly lowered the crystal glass in his hand after receiving the physician's report. His expression remained perfectly composed, but his fingers tightened around the parchment. One frightened Omega should not have changed anything, he murmured to himself. Then he folded the report into the fire without another word, watching every trace of the impossible disappear beneath the flames, while already deciding that the girl from Grey Ridge had become far more dangerous than anyone realized. Morning sunlight spilled across the eastern towers of Blackstone Keep, washing the ancient stone in soft shades of gold that had not seemed this warm in years. The servants noticed it first. The heavy feeling that usually lingered after every full moon had lifted, replaced by cautious smiles and quiet conversations that echoed through halls once ruled by fear. Evelyn stood beside one of the tall garden windows, watching frost melt from the castle roses as Margaret arranged fresh flowers along the dining table. "They have not bloomed this late in autumn since before the curse began," Margaret said with quiet wonder. Evelyn smiled gently, believing the flowers deserved the credit rather than herself. She had never thought of herself as extraordinary. She was simply someone who refused to walk away from another lonely soul. Across the castle, Damien sat inside the royal library surrounded by shelves of weathered books that chronicled generations of kings. Dr. Henry Whitmore carefully completed another examination before closing his notebook with a thoughtful sigh. "Your Majesty, your pulse remained steady throughout the night. Even the silver markings have almost disappeared." Damien looked toward the morning light streaming through the tall windows. "Then why does this feel temporary?" The physician hesitated. "Perhaps because the curse has survived every attempt to remove it. We should remain hopeful, but cautious." Damien nodded slowly. He had learned long ago that hope could disappear faster than winter sunlight. Still, one question continued to echo in his thoughts. Why had Evelyn's presence succeeded where every healer had failed? Before he could speak again, a royal attendant entered carrying a sealed invitation. "Lord Victor requests the young Omega's presence for breakfast in the council dining hall." Damien's expression immediately hardened. "She will dine here instead." The attendant bowed and quietly withdrew without argument. Hundreds of feet away, inside the council chamber, Lord Victor Blackwood calmly stirred his tea while listening to one of his advisors describe the unusual events from the previous evening. "The servants are already calling it a miracle," the advisor admitted nervously. Victor's eyes remained fixed on the fireplace. Miracles encouraged dangerous questions. He placed his cup on the table with deliberate care. If the people begin believing the king can be cured, they will begin asking who benefited from his illness. The room fell silent. Victor rose and walked toward the window overlooking the castle gardens below. There, Evelyn laughed softly as Margaret showed her a patch of late blooming roses. The simple sound drifted upward on the crisp mountain breeze. Victor watched without emotion. "The girl has become a problem," he said quietly. "Problems must be solved before they become legends." That afternoon, Margaret asked Evelyn to help deliver fresh herbs to the castle infirmary. The task seemed ordinary enough, and Evelyn gladly accepted. As she crossed one of the older stone bridges connecting two wings of the castle, she noticed a small white owl sitting alone along the railing. One delicate wing drooped awkwardly, preventing the bird from taking flight. Evelyn slowly approached, speaking in the same gentle voice she had always used with frightened animals back home. The owl did not flee. Instead, it watched her with unusually bright golden eyes while allowing her to carefully lift it into her hands. She wrapped the tiny creature inside her shawl, whispering comforting words until its trembling eased. Hidden behind a nearby column, Damien had witnessed the entire moment while returning from a council meeting. He had expected the owl to panic. Instead, it rested peacefully against Evelyn as though it had known her forever. Damien remembered something his mother had once told him when he was only a boy. The moon goddess always reveals the true heart of a ruler through the creatures that trust them first. For the first time in many years, he wondered whether fate had brought Evelyn to Blackstone Keep for a reason far greater than breaking a curse. Unseen by either of them, a hooded figure quietly stepped into the shadows of the corridor, and slipped a folded message beneath Lord Victor's chamber door. The note contained only 6 carefully written words. She has begun changing the castle already. The following evening arrived wrapped in quiet clouds that softened the moonlight over Blackstone Keep, and with it came a peace the castle had almost forgotten. Evelyn had spent the afternoon helping Margaret organize the neglected greenhouse, where vines once thought lifeless now showed tiny green shoots pushing through weathered branches. Every servant who passed offered her a warmer smile than the day before, although she still could not understand why everyone looked at her as though she had accomplished something remarkable. To Evelyn, she had simply listened when everyone else had expected fear. As twilight settled across the mountains, Dr. Henry Whitmore invited Damien to the ancient royal archives beneath the castle. Dust floated through narrow beams of lantern light as they descended stone steps worn smooth by centuries of kings. Shelves filled with faded journals, maps, and handwritten records stretched farther than Evelyn would have imagined possible. Dr. Whitmore carefully removed a weathered leather volume marked only with the royal crest and placed it upon a carved oak table. "These are the private observations of your grandfather," he explained quietly. Damien opened the brittle pages with careful hands. Most described ordinary matters of harvests, treaties, and seasonal ceremonies, until one folded parchment slipped free and drifted onto the table. Across its yellowed surface appeared a drawing unlike anything Damien had seen before. It showed a woman standing beneath a full moon while silver light surrounded her, calming a great wolf rather than controlling it. Beneath the illustration were words written in faded ink. "When the moon chooses compassion over power, the forgotten daughter shall quiet the restless king." Damien read the sentence twice before looking toward the physician. "Why has no one shown me this?" Dr. Whitmore lowered his eyes. "Because those pages disappeared before your father became king. I only found them this morning hidden behind a loose stone in the archive wall." Damien traced the edge of the ancient drawing. The woman's features had faded with time, yet something about her gentle posture reminded him of Evelyn standing beside the injured owl. She had not demanded trust. She had simply offered kindness until trust arrived on its own. Above them, Evelyn wandered through the moonlit greenhouse carrying a small lantern. The white owl she had rescued earlier rested comfortably on a nearby branch, its injured wing already stronger. As she watered the roses, she noticed an unfamiliar silver flower blooming near the center of the garden. Margaret had told her that every plant in this section had withered years ago when the curse first appeared. Curious, Evelyn reached toward the blossom. The moment her fingertips brushed one delicate petal, the flower released a faint shimmer that drifted into the cool evening air before disappearing like scattered starlight. She stepped back in surprise, believing her tired eyes had imagined it. Hidden behind an ivy-covered archway, Father Samuel had witnessed everything. His weathered face slowly filled with quiet wonder. "The moon garden has awakened," he whispered to himself. "It only blooms for the bloodline chosen by the goddess." At that very moment, Lord Victor entered his private study where another sealed report waited upon his desk. He broke the wax and read only a single sentence before his expression darkened. "The ancient moon garden has begun blooming again after 12 silent years." Victor carefully folded the message and looked toward the distant greenhouse glowing beneath the rising moon. "So the old prophecy was real after all," he murmured. "Then the girl cannot be allowed to learn who she truly is before I finish what I started many years ago." The discovery hidden within the royal archives remained locked inside Damien's thoughts as dawn painted the mountain peaks with soft bands of gold. He had read the ancient prophecy so many times that every word now echoed in his mind. Compassion over power. The forgotten daughter. The restless king. None of it sounded like coincidence anymore. Yet he refused to burden Evelyn with questions she could not answer. She had arrived believing herself unwanted. He would not allow the castle to replace one impossible expectation with another. That morning he found her walking through the eastern gardens with the white owl resting comfortably on her shoulder. Its injured wing had healed enough for short flights, but it continued returning to her as though it had chosen its own guardian. Evelyn looked up and smiled with quiet surprise. "Good morning, Your Majesty." Damien returned the smile, one that came more naturally than it had in years. "Please call me Damien." She hesitated before nodding. "Only if you call me Evelyn." For a brief moment, the titles separating a king from an outcast seemed to disappear beneath the morning sunlight. They wandered together through the garden paths while Margaret and several servants watched discreetly from a distance. None of them could remember seeing their king walk without the burden that had shadowed every step for so long. As they reached the moon garden, Evelyn noticed dozens of silver blossoms now blooming where empty soil had covered the ground only days before. Tiny butterflies drifted lazily among the flowers, and the air carried a gentle fragrance unlike any she had known. "They were not here yesterday," she whispered. Damien studied the blossoms before answering. "Neither were they here for 12 years. Evelyn knelt beside one of the flowers, careful not to disturb its delicate petals. "Maybe they were simply waiting." Damien looked at her thoughtfully. "For spring." She gently shook her head. "For kindness." Her answer lingered between them, simple enough to sound obvious, yet powerful enough to quiet every explanation built upon fear. Hidden behind the branches of an old cedar tree, Father Samuel watched the exchange with growing certainty. He quietly opened an ancient prayer book he always carried and compared the blooming flowers with a faded illustration drawn centuries earlier. Every detail matched perfectly. He closed the book and whispered, "The chosen heart has returned." Inside the council chamber, however, the atmosphere had become far less peaceful. Lord Victor stood before several trusted advisors with another parchment spread across the table. This one contained a copy of the old prophecy Dr. Whitmore had secretly recovered. Victor's expression remained calm, but his voice carried quiet urgency. "The prophecy speaks of compassion because compassion inspires loyalty," he said. "If the people begin believing the king has been chosen by destiny instead of cursed by fate, every alliance inside this kingdom will change." One advisor shifted uneasily. "What should we do?" Victor slowly rolled the parchment closed. "Separate them before the bond becomes impossible to break." That afternoon, an official message arrived from Greyridge Pack. The elders requested permission to visit Blackstone Keep and personally thank the crown for accepting Evelyn's sacrifice. Margaret frowned as she finished reading the letter aloud. Damien's silver eyes narrowed. He remembered the emptiness in Evelyn's voice when she admitted no one had tried to stop her from leaving. Now the very people who had abandoned her wished to stand inside his castle. He folded the letter carefully and looked toward the garden, where Evelyn laughed softly as the white owl circled above blooming silver flowers. "Prepare the guest quarters," he said quietly. "I want to hear exactly why they have finally decided she is worth visiting." 3 days later, the banners of Greyridge Pack appeared beyond the castle gates, carried by riders who had once passed Evelyn without a second glance. From the highest balcony, she watched the familiar colors flutter in the cool mountain breeze, and instead of feeling excitement, she felt only quiet uncertainty. Blackstone Keep had become the first place where people asked whether she had eaten, whether she had rested, and whether she wished to join them for supper. The village she had once called home had never offered those simple kindnesses. Margaret gently touched her shoulder. "You do not have to greet them if you are not ready." Evelyn offered a grateful smile. "Running away never changed anyone's heart. Perhaps listening will." Down in the grand reception hall, Damien stood beside the royal throne as the visitors entered beneath towering stone arches. The Greyridge elders bowed deeply, their expressions carefully respectful. Elder Thomas, who had signed the decree sending Evelyn away only days before, stepped forward carrying an ornate wooden chest filled with polished gemstones and woven blankets. "Your Majesty," he began smoothly, "our pack wishes to express its gratitude for accepting our humble daughter into your noble household." Damien's silver eyes remained calm, but the silence that followed made every person in the hall noticeably uncomfortable. Finally he spoke. "Your daughter." Elder Thomas smiled uneasily. "She has always been one of our own." Damien slowly descended the steps, separating the throne from the visitors. "Interesting." His voice never rose, yet every word carried unmistakable weight. "When she left your village, how many people came to say goodbye?" No one answered. "How many asked whether she wished to leave?" The elders exchanged uncertain glances. "How many called her family before learning she might save a king?" The questions settled over the hall like falling snow. Evelyn entered quietly from the side corridor before anyone could invent an answer. Every head turned toward her. She looked exactly as she had when she left Greyridge. wearing a simple blue dress Margaret had prepared for her, yet something had undeniably changed. She no longer carried herself like someone apologizing for existing. Elder Thomas immediately forced a warm smile. "Evelyn, child, we are relieved to see you healthy." She studied his face for several long moments before replying gently. "That is kind of you to say." There was no anger in her voice, only honesty, and somehow that honesty made the room even quieter. Father Samuel watched from the rear of the hall with thoughtful eyes. He had witnessed countless royal negotiations, but never one where kindness revealed the truth more clearly than accusation ever could. Damien stepped beside Evelyn instead of in front of her, allowing her to choose her own words. She looked at the visitors from the village she had once tried so hard to please. "I do not hate any of you," she said softly. "I only wish someone had believed my life mattered before another kingdom did." Several villagers lowered their eyes. Even Elder Thomas struggled to answer. Before another word could be spoken, Dr. Henry Whitmore hurried into the hall carrying an ancient scroll he had been studying throughout the morning. His face showed equal parts excitement and disbelief. "Your Majesty," he said, slightly out of breath, "I finally translated the missing passage." Damien accepted the scroll. Across the faded parchment appeared one final sentence hidden beneath the prophecy they already knew. "The forgotten daughter shall quiet the restless king, but only when the truth of her birth is revealed beneath the moon crown." Evelyn looked up in confusion. She had never heard of a moon crown. Across the hall, Lord Victor quietly closed his eyes for the briefest moment. The secret he had buried for more than 20 years had finally begun finding its own voice. That evening, the castle chapel stood quietly beneath the glow of a brilliant full moon as Father Samuel placed an ancient silver circlet upon a velvet cushion before the altar. The moon crown had rested untouched for generations, waiting for a moment that most people believed would never come. Every person gathered inside the chapel remained silent as Dr. Henry Whitmore finished reading the final lines of the restored prophecy. It did not speak of conquest or power. It spoke of truth, compassion, and a heart that refused to abandon another even when the world had already turned away. Evelyn looked at the delicate crown with uncertainty. "I do not understand," she admitted softly. Father Samuel smiled with gentle kindness. "Then perhaps the moon will explain what history could not." Margaret carefully guided Evelyn toward the altar while Damien remained only a few steps away, unwilling to pressure her, yet ready to stand beside her if she needed him. Evelyn hesitated before reaching for the silver circlet. The moment it rested lightly upon her head, a gentle glow spread through the chapel, not bright enough to blind anyone, but warm enough to soften every shadow in the room. The stained glass windows reflected silver and gold across the stone floor as a peaceful stillness settled over everyone present. Father Samuel slowly opened a sealed parchment hidden beneath the altar for decades. His eyes widened as he read the royal seal pressed into the faded wax. "This is the final testimony of Queen Eleanor," he whispered. Margaret covered her mouth in disbelief. Queen Eleanor had vanished more than 20 years earlier, and with her disappearance many truths had been buried. Father Samuel continued reading aloud. "If these words are ever found, know that my newborn daughter was hidden beyond the palace to protect her from those who feared the ancient prophecy. She shall grow among ordinary people until the moon calls her home." The chapel became completely silent. Evelyn felt her breath catch as Father Samuel looked directly at her. "Your birth name was never Carter," he said gently. "You are Princess Evelyn Eleanor Blackwood, the lost daughter of the royal bloodline." Damien stared at her with quiet astonishment, not because she had royal blood, but because the lonely young woman who had believed she belonged nowhere had unknowingly carried the kingdom's oldest hope within her all along. Across the chapel, Lord Victor lowered his head, realizing the secret he had guarded through silence could no longer remain hidden. Before anyone could accuse him, he quietly removed the signet ring from his hand and placed it upon the altar. "The truth has found its rightful place," he said with weary honesty. "No secret can outlive destiny." Father Samuel accepted the ring without anger. Justice had arrived through revelation rather than revenge. As the chapel bells began ringing across the mountains, Damien stepped toward Evelyn. The faint silver markings that had haunted him for years had completely disappeared beneath the moonlight. Dr. Whitmore smiled through grateful tears. The curse is gone. Damien looked into Evelyn's eyes, seeing not a sacrifice, not a prophecy, and not even a princess. He saw the woman whose simple decision to stay had restored hope to an entire kingdom. Evelyn smiled back with quiet warmth. I never came here to save a king, she said. Damien returned her smile. Yet you reminded one how to live. Outside the chapel, the moon garden bloomed brighter than ever before as the white owl soared freely into the night sky above Blackstone Keep. News of the miracle spread across every village, not as the story of a curse finally ending, but as the story of an overlooked heart whose kindness proved stronger than fear. And for generations afterward, parents told their children that true strength was never measured by power, titles, or destiny, but by the courage to remain beside someone when everyone else chose to walk away. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts, like, share, subscribe, enable notifications, and join us for more unforgettable alpha romance stories ahead.